Hello everyone, welcome to CU Forums, week 6. Wow, it's going very quickly. So Forum is an event run by CU and looking at various topics about the Christian faith and how that fits in how we live our lives. CU is for anyone who's interested in Jesus, no matter what you believe. So I'm glad you're all made it here today. This week we're very lucky to have Dr. Chris Watkin. He's going to be speaking to us about the topic, does believing the Bible make people violent? I'm super keen to hear it. Super interesting topic. Chris currently teaches at Monash. So yeah, coming over to the other side today. He teaches from French to literature and everything in between. And also teaches about ad hoc, about theology and religion. So yeah, it's very exciting to hear from him. So let's give him a warm welcome.
It's a real thrill for me to be here. I came here a couple of years ago and had such a rich time with, I guess now, your predecessors on a similar topic to this, talking afterwards. I'm really humbled and privileged to be here again and to have the opportunity to think through these things with you guys. Thank you for giving up your lunch hour. Thank you for coming. My job is to try and make it worthwhile for you, and I'll certainly try my best to do that. The topic that I chose and that CU said is okay for me to talk on is whether believing the Bible makes people...
Doesn't want to go to the earlier slides for some reason.
Okay.
So, I don't know what's going on. For that one,
That's fine.
it's just not coming up.
Well, leave it like that and I'll do it from there.
Okay.
Lovely. Beautiful. Thank you. Whether believing the Bible makes people violent or whether believing in exclusive religious truth claims in general make people violent. It is, I guess, a commonly held opinion in our society, and one not without evidence, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, that people who hold exclusive religious truth claims are often seen to be those in society who are pretty violent about things. Think historically about the Crusades. Think about the wars of religion in the 16th century. The picture on the top left there is the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that you may be aware of, where we estimate between 5,000 and 30,000 French Protestant Huguenots were slaughtered by the Catholics in a short period of time. And of course, the atrocities happened in the opposite direction as well, Protestants killing Catholics. So historically, religion seems to have a great deal to answer for. If we look at our own day, we don't have to look far to find examples of religious people being pretty violent. Think about the infamous, almost caricaturally infamous Westboro Baptist Church, holding up derogatory signs against anyone they happen to disagree with, saying that it's good that soldiers die in war, for example. It's a pretty obnoxious, pretty violent thing to be held by those people who have exclusive religious claims. Or think in the countries surrounding Uganda in northeast Africa about the Lord's, so-called Lord's Resistance Army, and the way they recruit child soldiers and send them to war in the name of the Christian religion. Again, it seems that the examples abound of people who claim to have exclusive religious truth claims behaving very violently. And people might therefore be forgiven for echoing the views of Thomas Jefferson when he said, millions of innocent men, women and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined and imprisoned. And yet, we have not advanced 1 inch towards uniformity. And he's not alone, is he? He's not an outlying voice. It's not uncommon these days to hear people making the argument that firmly held religious beliefs are the cause, often the main cause, of violence within and between societies today. And furthermore, the argument is that what is dangerous about such beliefs is precisely that they are religious beliefs. It's the religious nature of them that makes them particularly dangerous and obnoxious. The problem, more precisely, it's claimed, is with religious exclusivity. So if I believe, for example, that I'm saved and that you are damned, then I'm more likely to be violent to you than if I believe that we're both on the same earth just trying to figure out what on earth is going on around us. It predisposes me to be violent. And for many people today, therefore, the rejection of religious exclusivity is just so obvious that it's simply common sense. We can't have a functioning society in which people hold these rigid religious claims if we hope to be able to live together in peace. And the thinking goes something like this. If we're all going to get on together, we can't have some people believing that their way is the only way, because it will always lead to those people trying to impose their views on other people, either by law or by violence, or in the worst case, by war. And the point was captured powerfully over a decade ago now, in the aftermath of the London tube bombings in 2005, by Muriel Gray, who was writing in the Sun Herald. And she tried to sum up her view of the aftermath of this terrorist incident in the following way. She said, everyone is being blamed, from the obvious villainous duo of George W. Bush and Tony Blair, the American president and British Prime Minister of the time, to the inaction of Muslim, quote, communities. But it has never been clearer that there is only one place to lay the blame, and that it has ever been this. The cause of all this misery, mayhem, violence, terror and ignorance is, of course, religion itself. And if it seems ludicrous to have to state such an obvious reality, the fact is that the government and media are doing a pretty good job of pretending that it isn't so. And Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion picks up this quotation from Muriel Gray, and he elaborates on her thinking. And he tries to analyse what's at stake in such a situation. And for Dawkins, what's at stake is the way in which religions draw lines and create in-groups and out-groups. And this is how he puts it. He says, from Kosovo to Palestine, from Iraq to Sudan, from Ulster to the Indian subcontinent, look carefully at any religion of the world, any region of the world, where you find intractable enmity and violence between rival groups today. I cannot guarantee that you'll find religions as the dominant labels for the in-groups and the out-groups, but it is a good bet. So then the problem with religion, according to Gray and Dawkins and many people in our society, the problem with religion is that it draws lines. It labels in-groups and out-groups. And that paves the way for aggression and for violence. So, to expand on Dawkins' thinking, religion creates a sort of slippery slope. And we can schematise it as something like this. The slippery slope begins by drawing a line. I've got the truth, you haven't. I'm in the in-group, you're in the out-group. Secondly, that line gives birth to a judgment. We're the good guys. You are necessarily, therefore, the bad guys. And I start feeling superior to you. Or you to me, whichever way around it is. Thirdly, that superiority leads to a separation. I don't want to associate with you. Fourthly, from a place of separation, it becomes easy to caricature the people who are on the other side of the line. And fifthly, from caricature, it's only a small step to passive aggression, and then a further step to active oppression. The slippery slope leading from drawing a line, creating an in-group and an out-group, to aggression and oppression. But of course, drawing lines isn't restricted to religious groups. All sorts of groups within society draw all sorts of different lines. We have ethnic lines, national lines, political lines, educational lines, in Melbourne perhaps particularly sporting lines. But the argument of people like Gray and Dawkins is that it's the exclusive claims, particularly of religion, the way in which religion in particular draws lines. Not simply that I'm right and that you're wrong, but that God is on my side, that predisposes people to violence. That's the problem. Now, as you may have guessed, I am a Christian, and I'm going to be arguing today from a Christian point of view. But before I get into that argument, I want to stand shoulder to shoulder with Gray and Dawkins in at least two significant ways. I agree with them when they say, first of all, that religion does draw lines, that begin leading us down a slippery slope to violence. And that's true, empirically, demonstrably true. And secondly, I agree that we should avoid the sort of line drawing that leads us down slippery slopes. But I also part company from them on two significant points. First of all, I think that the sort of solutions that people like Dawkins and Gray and others propose to the problem of religious exclusivity won't put an end to violence, as they hope. And secondly, although Christians most certainly have been part of the problem, in many cases a large part of the problem, in violence in our societies, I think that what the Bible teaches positions Christians well to contribute to a solution to those problems. And that's essentially going to be the rest of my talk. I'm going to try and expand both of those points in the time that I've got left. So first I'm going to consider a prominent way in which our society seeks to deal with claims to religious exclusivity. And then I'm going to show how Christians can, should they take the Bible seriously, position themselves to be part of a solution to this problem. First of all, I want to think then about how our society considers claims to religious exclusivity. And I think, you may or may not agree with me on this, but as I reflected on this, I think that there are two positions that are held that seem superficially in contradiction with each other, but aren't. Our society thinks that all religions are equally right, and it thinks that all religions are equally wrong. There's a religious version of this, and there's a secular version of this view. Let's deal first with the idea that all religions are equally right. The religious version says something like this. Christians and Hindus and Muslims and Buddhists and Jains and Zoroastrians, etc., are all true in that they're all ultimately talking about the same God at the end of the day. They're all reaching out to the same ultimate spiritual reality. The secular version of this says that all these religions are legitimate cultural and ethnic expressions, part of people's traditions and heritages to be honoured and fostered and cultivated. I think there are a couple of problems with most manifestations of this view. I think it forecloses proper dialogue, and I think it denies diversity. So first of all, it forecloses dialogue. It forecloses dialogue because it refuses to listen to what the religions are actually saying. Just let's take one example. It is a core claim of Christianity. Paul in one of his letters says it's a thing of first importance. That Jesus Christ died on the cross for our sins to save us. And it was Christ who died. Now, it is a deeply held tenet of Muslim belief that it wasn't Christ who died on the cross. Now, both the Christian and the Muslim would recognise that both of those claims can't be right. They might both be wrong, or one of them might be right, but they're not both right. And so to deny that only one of them can be right, to say, no, you're both right, I think undermines a fundamental diversity in world religions. It claims that people essentially believe the same thing, when those very same people would adamantly say, no, we don't actually believe the same thing. There's a diversity in our beliefs that is being airbrushed out if you say we're fundamentally pointing towards the same spiritual reality. Now, both the Christian and the Muslim, in my example, are practicing diversity when they say, no, we really don't agree. We believe different things about this. But the pluralism that would try and force them into a mould where they're both fundamentally believing the same thing about spiritual realities is denying that diversity. And if we wanted to be slightly more strident about it, we could say that that pluralism at that point is quite imperialistic. So then, that's the view that all religions are equally right. But there's also a view in our society that all religions are equally wrong. Each religion, it is thought, has perhaps a part of the truth. It's onto something. It's not utterly fallacious in absolutely everything it says. But none of them has the whole truth. And they're certainly untrue when they make exclusive claims to truth. I'm sure you're familiar with the illustration of this point with the blind men and the elephant. It's often told in a prosaic way, but I much prefer the poetic rendering of it by John Godfrey Saxe in his poem The Blind Men and the Elephants. I'm going to, if you will indulge me, just read a couple of verses from the poem. His first line is, "It was 6 men of Indus stamp," but I want to bring it a bit closer to home, so I'm going to say there were 6 men of Melbourne town, if you'll allow me. "There were 6 men of Melbourne town to learning much inclined, who went to see the elephant, though all of them were blind, that each by observation might satisfy his mind. The first approached the elephant, and happening to fall against the broad and sturdy side, at once began to bawl, 'God bless me, but the elephant is very like a wall.' The second, feeling the tusk, cried, 'What have we here? So very round and smooth and sharp. To me 'tis mighty clear, this wonder of an elephant is very like a spear.' And so on and so on and so on. Point being made, of course, is that each religion grasps only a part of the truth, and that none of them is grasping the whole truth. Now, of course, the problem with the illustration is that in order to know that each of the religions is grasping part of the truth and that none of them is grasping the whole truth, the teller of the story, our perspective, needs to see the whole truth. We need to see the elephant in order to understand that each religion is only getting a bit of it. As this visual representation quite nicely shows. The reason that we find it mildly amusing is that we can see that it's an elephant. If we couldn't see that, then the point of the poem, the point of the illustration would be lost. So we need to have the truth in order to see that they don't. Bishop and missionary Leslie Newbigin drew out this complexity of this illustration in his book, The Gospel in a Pluralist Society, and he put it this way. There's an appearance of humility in the protestation that the truth is greater than any of us can grasp. But if this is used to invalidate all claims to discern truth, then it is in fact an arrogant claim to a kind of knowledge which is superior to all others. We have to ask, what is the absolute vantage ground from which you claim to be able to relativize all the absolute claims these different scriptures make? So in other words, the person who tells the elephant story, according to Newbigin, is claiming precisely what she says no religion should claim, namely superior knowledge. There's a third variant of this view in our society, and it's the view that expresses itself something like this. We simply can't know what is true, so it's wrong to try and convert people to one or another understanding of what truth is. But again, this position is, to a large extent, guilty of the crime that it accuses others of. Saying we simply can't know, so it is wrong to convert, is itself an exclusive and proselytizing religious belief. Now, in this, I'm leaning heavily on an argument made by a Christian theologian and pastor called Tim Keller in his book, The Reason for God. So I hold up my hands. This is pretty much Keller from now on. These are not my ideas. I'm not taking credit for this. But he says something like this. Now, I'm convinced by his argument. See what you make of it. Let's take it piece by piece. First of all, to claim that we cannot know, is a belief. It's not empirically proven. Indeed, it's not empirically proven. Secondly, it's a religious belief in the sense that it's a belief about spiritual or ultimate reality, about religious things, namely that there aren't any of them. Thirdly, it's an exclusive religious belief, because only people who agree that we cannot know the truth have the truth. But unlike the exclusive claims of world religions, it's self-refuting. Because if no one can know the truth about spiritual reality, then it's hard to claim that we can know that no one can know the truth about spiritual reality. How do we know that no one can know if no one can know? When we say no one has a take on spiritual reality that's superior to anyone else's, that sentence right there is a take on spiritual reality that is putting itself forward as superior to other takes on spiritual reality. And fourthly, it's a proselytizing exclusive religious belief. It's trying to convert people to the position that it's wrong to convert people. saying you shouldn't try and convert people to your view of religious reality is telling me just as forcefully to do something as if I was saying you should try and convert people to your view of religious reality. You want your listener to stop doing one thing and start doing another thing. You want them to stop converting people and start not converting people. Just as if you wanted them to stop not converting people and start converting. So, the point that I want to draw out of all of this analysis so far is I hope, quite a simple one. Everybody draws lines. Everybody creates in-groups and out-groups. The religious person draws lines, for example, between those who have the truth and those who don't have the truth. The pluralist draws lines between the religious people who think they have the truth and the pluralists who know that the religious people don't have the truth. The new atheist draws lines between the enlightened atheist and the dangerous religious people that are the source of so much violence. The honest skeptic draws lines between honest skepticism and dogmatism of all sorts, both religious and secular. Or finally, although we could go on and on, the liberal, or the progressive perhaps, draws lines between the bigots who draw lines and the good inclusive liberals who don't draw lines. Everybody draws lines. So it's not only that religious people make exclusive claims or draw lines or create in-groups and out-groups. Everybody draws lines out of religion, atheism, pluralism, honest skepticism, liberalism, and so on. We cannot avoid drawing lines if we're going to live in society. So what matters for the question of violence, and my argument is pivoting at this point, what matters for the question of violence is therefore not whether we draw lines, because everybody does. What matters is how our particular belief system predisposes us to treat people on the other side of our line. Just say that again. What matters is not whether we draw lines, because everybody does, but how our particular belief system predisposes us to treat people on the other side of our particular line. And therefore, if we want to find a solution to the slippery slope problem of drawing lines leading to violence, the solution is not to end exclusive truth claims, because everybody has some sort of exclusive claim. But what we need is people who have got an exclusive truth claim that predisposes them to treat those on the other side of their line well and non-violently. At the beginning of the talk I said I'd make two arguments. I've done one, I'm about to do the second one. So halfway through, hang in there. The one that I've done, at least in my opinion, you are nowhere near to having done it, but I've got to move on. The one that I am leaving now, shall we say, and putting no more effort into until question time, is the argument that the solutions proposed to the problems of religious exclusivity by people like Dawkins and Gray won't actually achieve what they and I hope that they would achieve, which is an end to that sort of violence. Now I'm going to move on to the second part of my presentation, the second argument, that although Christians have been and continue to be a big part of the problem in this area, it is actually precisely because of the exclusive truth claims of Christianity that Christians can also contribute to the solution, not in spite of the exclusive truth claims, but because of them. And so this section, therefore, depends upon the nature of those specific truth claims. So I'm going to stop talking about religion in general, and I'm going to talk much more specifically about the Bible and what it says, and particularly about one story that Jesus tells. It's a story that's found in Luke chapter 18 in the Bible. And I will, if you will permit me, just read through it before I make a few comments on what's going on here. So Jesus is telling a parable. This is not something necessarily that really happened. He's telling an illustrative story in order to prove a spiritual truth or point to his listeners. So he, Jesus, told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. He said, 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus: God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, says Jesus, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus is telling a story about righteousness, or justification is the same root word. To be righteous is to be approved, to have someone say to you, you're in, put in the in group, you're doing okay, you're good. We can see this approval and seek this approval indeed in the workplace, at home, on the sports field, in our own inner conversation. It's whoever we give the right to tell us, you're okay, you're doing fine, whether that's ourselves or someone else. Christian righteousness is to seek that approval from God, to be God who says to you, you're okay. Now, we've got two characters in the story. We've got a Pharisee and a tax collector. Let's just take them one by one. And the Pharisee first. He's not a hypocrite. The Pharisee is a good man. He doesn't fiddle his tax returns. He goes back into the shop if he finds out they're giving him too much change. He's never cheated on his wife. But like the first audience of this story, for Jesus, he, quote, trusts in himself that he is righteous, verse 9. He says, I'm approved by God because of what I do, because of the good things that I do, because I am genuinely a good person. His identity comes from his performance. I fast twice a week, he says. I give tithes of all that I get. Or to update the language a little, today perhaps we might say, I let reason guide me. I'm a scientific evidentialist. I'm a proper Christian. Read my Bible every day. I'm a good Muslim. I'm a political progressive. I'm a political conservative. I'm open-minded. I cultivate a healthy and mature scepticism. That is why I'm okay. And from this position, notice the Pharisee can't help drawing lines. God, he says, I thank you that I am not like other men. Indeed, interestingly, the very word Pharisee means separated one who's separated himself off from the rest of people, inevitably looks down on them. And this is what Keller, quite helpfully I think, calls a performance narrative. Narrative, sort of the big story that structures my life and how I see myself. A performance narrative. The performance narrative says something like this. My status comes from my performance, from what I do. So the religious person will say, I fast, I tithe, I keep my religion's laws. And from that point, like the Pharisee, it predisposes that person to looking down their nose at irreligious people and ill-disciplined people. But of course, you've got to watch out, because that is the first step down the slippery slope to violence. Or the good progressive might say, I'm approved because I'm open-minded, I'm working for the poor. And that view predisposes them to look down on narrow-minded bigots. But watch out, that's the first step down the slippery slope to violence. And the new atheist might say, I'm approved because I'm guided by my reason, I look only to the hard facts of science, which predisposes them to look down their nose at those who are still in thrall to medieval and dangerous superstition, which puts them on the first step of the slippery slope, etc. So the problem with all these views is that if we are saved by our performance, whatever that performance is, religious, non-religious, doesn't matter, that is what sets us down the slippery slope that leads eventually to violence. But in the story, Jesus condemns this performance narrative, doesn't he? He says that this Pharisee, despite all appearances, he's the bishop, he's the religious person, despite all appearances, he doesn't go home righteous. God doesn't say, you're okay, to the Pharisee, which would have been a huge scandal to the time, to the way that society viewed people like that. They were at the top. I don't think bishops are at the top anymore, but you've got to try and think yourself into a society where religious people are still very much looked up to. It's a figure of authority in society. Jesus says he's not okay with God. God is not saying to this pillar of society, you're good. What Jesus does say, and this would have come as even more of a scandal to the society of the time, was that it is in fact the tax collector who is approved by God. And he uses the example of the tax collector to speak not about the performance narrative, but about what again Keller calls, and I think it's a helpful term, the grace narrative. The big idea of this grace narrative is that I am righteous, God says you're okay, not on the basis of anything that I do, not on the basis of my performance, but as a free and a radically, fundamentally undeserved gift from God. And Jesus uses the figure of the tax collector to explain the radical and subversive nature of this grace narrative. A little footnote on tax collectors in first century Palestine. They are not the gentlemen from the Australian tax office. They are collaborators with an oppressive Roman regime employed by the occupying force to extort money from their own people, able only to make money from themselves by collecting more tax than they're due. So if you think into sort of a Second World War occupation situation, say in France, and there's someone in your town collaborating with the Germans in order to get money to help the German war effort, it's that sort of dynamic. Tax collectors are not nice, respected people in this society at this time. They're despised. If we want equivalents in our society, we might think about pimps, perhaps gangsters. Not welcome, people not welcome in society, looked down upon. So there's this tax collector praying in the temple. And it's this man, this pimp, if you like, who, at the end of Jesus' story, is justified. God says to him, you're okay. Huge scandal to those listening to Jesus' story at the time. What does this tax collector do? Well, he brings no performance to the table. When he speaks to God, he doesn't make reference to what he's done, what he's going to do, what he might do, the goodness of his heart. None of that. He says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. And Jesus says, I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, right with God, rather than the Pharisee. So the tax collector then is approved, he's justified, he's righteous, but in a way utterly divorced from any performance, or even any promised performance on his part. He's no criterion, therefore, to look down on anyone else, because his approval from God didn't come from being more moral, it didn't come from being more rational, didn't come from being more compassionate, or more anything than anyone else. Jesus doesn't operate, I think it's pretty clear from this parable, according to a performance narrative. He doesn't respect the performance narrative. He doesn't respect people who come to him saying, I'm okay, aren't I, Jesus, because of whatever it is. I'm this, I think that, I do that, I'm this sort of person. And I think the grace narrative can be distilled in terms of 4 points. They might run something like this. By God's standards, if not also by our own, but certainly by God's, we are all failures. We haven't found God by dint of moral achievement or intellectual brilliance, and furthermore, we never will. Jesus Christ comes and saves us, not because he sees a spark of potential in us, but because of himself, because he loves us. That's it. Not because of anything. And therefore grace is received as a gift, it's not achieved as a performance. And this, again in Keller's terms, makes Christianity the most inclusive exclusivity, because one doesn't need to pass an intelligence test or to have lived in a moral way in order to be in. Because you're not saved by performing, but through admitting you can't perform. And the tax collector who says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. My claim to justice has been exhausted. I am now relying on mercy. The way that Keller puts it is that your only fitness is to admit you're not fit. And therefore Christianity is a great leveller, because it allows the weakest to come. You don't need to be more able to wield rational arguments than your neighbour. You don't need to be more educated, more moral, more rational, more open-minded, more sceptical, more anything than the next person to be in the in-group. In fact, drawing a line on the basis of any of those criteria in and of itself would disqualify you from being in the in-group from the beginning. That is the one way to make sure that you're not in, to find a reason for being in. So both young and old, educated and uneducated, rich and poor, upright and criminal, can all come on exactly the same basis, with no differentiation. So then if I'm operating in a grace narrative, I am very happy to acknowledge that my Hindu or Muslim or atheist neighbour might very well be a smarter and more moral person than I am. Because I'm not saved. My identity, my nature doesn't rely on me being better than them in any way. In fact, it relies on me recognising that I'm a pretty flawed person. I'm relying on mercy, not on justice. And also, significantly, I simply cannot look down on them, because my in-group has absolutely no implications of anyone else's inferiority whatsoever. And if I don't acknowledge that, then I simply haven't understood the grace narrative. I'm still a Pharisee. I'm still operating out of a performance narrative. The second reason why Christianity is the most inclusive exclusivity is that God loves his enemies. Jesus didn't merely refuse to look down his nose on those on the other side of his line. The Bible claims that Jesus died for the people on the other side of his line. So at the heart of the Christian faith then, the heart of the biblical testimony, is a man who dies for people who are not good, who do not show a spark of potential, who are not moral, who are on the other side of the line. The Christian God is the God who loves his enemies. And Christians likewise are enjoined in no uncertain terms in the Bible to love our enemies as well. Matthew 5:44, Luke 6:27. And it's at this point that the grace narrative empowers and propels Christians, commands Christians, to be agents of radical reconciliation in the world. Not simply tolerating our enemies, not simply trying to shut our enemies up, but loving our enemies, working out what that means in each individual situation. So I'd like for a moment to address the Christians here. I don't know who is and who isn't, so I'll just keep looking around generally. But these next few words are directed to Christians, and therefore to myself as well. We Christians have to admit, do we not, that we operate through a lot of our lives and a lot of our thinking out of a performance narrative. It is not therefore that we believe our own exclusive truth claim too much. It is that we do not believe it enough. Our exclusive truth claim is that at the bottom, it is the tax collector who is approved by God, not the Pharisee. Our exclusive truth claim is that God died for his enemies, and no one gets right with God but by trusting in that death. So then, Christian brothers and sisters, woe to us if we turn the grace narrative into a Phariseeism and don't use the subversive resources of that exclusive truth claim to subvert the slippery slope that leads from drawing lines to being violent. Okay, that's the end of the bits of the Christians. I'm speaking to everyone again. My conclusion's very brief. You will be, no doubt, pleased to hear. We started by examining the contention that if we're to avoid violence and live together in a democratic society, we simply cannot have people claiming that there's only one God and that they're right and that other people are wrong. First of all, I tried to show that the responses to the dangers of religious exclusivity that have come from, for example, Gray and Dawkins and others, won't achieve what both they and I hope that they could achieve, which is an end to the sort of violence that they want to bring an end to. Secondly, I tried to argue that we all draw lines, and that what matters is not whether we draw lines, because we all do, but how our particular belief system predisposes us to treat other people on the other side of our particular line. And thirdly, I argued that the biblical grace narrative is the most inclusive exclusivity, to use Keller's term, precisely because of its exclusive claim, not in spite of its exclusive claim. Christians have, I'll say it again, certainly been a big part of this problem. But I think by holding more tenaciously to the exclusive truth claim of Christianity, Christians can also position themselves to be a contributing factor towards a solution to this problem. Thank you. Now, as I was discussing before the talk, it's a big subject. It raises a lot of issues, some of which I've touched on, some of which I haven't. I believe there's a bit of a time for a discussion there. So feel free to ask a question, or if you just want to make a comment, and we'll see where the discussion takes us.
I just had a question about when you're talking about the Pharisee, were you saying that he was sinning because he was looking down on others through the lines that we drawn, or whether it was because he was claiming to be righteous and not relying on grace?
It's a wonderful question. Let's come back to the passage. I'll just read the verse out again and then I'll comment on it. Thank you. So Jesus told a parable to some people who, there's a hermeneutical clue here, that the framing of Jesus' parables is really important for understanding what he's trying to teach. So people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. So it seems that the attack, Jesus' attack here, is against people who think, I'm okay because of something to do with me. I'm trusting in myself. Something about me to make me okay with God. And then we get on to the tax collector, so the Pharisee in verse 11. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, I thank you that I am not like other men. Extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even like this tax collector, I fast twice a week, give tithes of all I get. So if you put those two together, it seems that what Jesus is getting at is that he looks at those things. I do this good religious stuff. I don't do that bad stuff. Therefore, I'm okay with God. And I think that's what Jesus is attacking. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
If Christianity is the most inclusive exclusivity and it shouldn't be violent, why do we still see so much violence coming from Christianity?
Because they don't believe the Bible.
Okay.
It's my argument. So how can you do that if you believe the grace narrative? There's a cognitive dissonance there. It doesn't. But I think in the same way that all belief systems, you can look at Marxism, you can look at communism, any belief system can be exploited for political ends, can be used as a label to cover over manoeuvring of all sorts. Christianity is by no means immune to that. And many people have very successfully used Christianity, conveniently excising the grace narrative, in order to do all sorts of stuff that they wanted to do anyway, before they'd even opened the Bible. So Christianity in that sense is just like every other ideology, just like every belief system. People can use it to do stuff that is bad, and do use it to do stuff that is bad. But what I'm claiming is that there's something that is in dissonance with this core teaching of Christianity when you do that. It doesn't fit. If you want to really run with the Bible, that's what I'm arguing, that doesn't fit. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Yes, sir.
So, what do you think the implications are for the idea of the conscience itself, in terms of trusting yourself as righteous? But don't you think there's a different idea when you think about kind of like the God-given conscience in a way, and like the capacity to kind of be moral? Isn't that different to not believing you're righteous, but you're just following kind of a I can't explain it. There's no kind of reflective element to that. You're not believing yourself righteous in that way. That's not really a performance in itself. That's more of but basically what's the role of the conscience in this context?
Yeah, really helpful question. So if I've understood this, where does the conscience fit into all of this? Doesn't that also guide? I think in general terms, the Bible has a circumspect place for conscience. That it can be a blunt instrument of a guardian in certain circumstances, but I don't think it ever encourages us to rest the whole weight of our judgment upon our conscience. Because like all our faculties, our thinking, our feeling, our whatever, it's not perfect, it's not inviolable. And it's quite possible, psychologically possible, sure, most of us would have experienced this at some point, to do something that you know is wrong, but to feel no kind of conscience about it. It's possible. I don't know whether, take a caricatural example, Hitler knew what he was doing was wrong and he was going against his conscience. It's quite possible, psychologically, it would appear to me that he didn't, and he probably thought that it was reasonable and good what he was doing. So I think conscience can be an important factor in trying to work out what decisions are right or wrong, but I don't think the Bible would encourage us to lean the full weight of our judgment on it. I think it would encourage us to educate our conscience and to cultivate a conscience sort of in hermeneutical circle with the Bible, but not simply to say, well, my conscience says that this is okay, and therefore, hey, it's okay. Or my conscience says that it's not okay, therefore it's not okay. I have nothing to run off with this, so if anyone wants to talk to me in a sort of less public way, I'm hanging around. Please feel free to call me at the end if you would.
Are there any resources if people want to delve more into the topic that you would recommend to people?
Well, I think Tim Keller's The Reason for God is really good. He's fresh. The stuff that I read in him, I haven't read. Well, before he published it, I hadn't read anywhere else. There's lots of people like me regurgitating it nowadays, but I think he's really helpful on this sort of thing. He's also written a follow-up book. So The Reason for God is for people who are already asking questions about God. He's written a follow-up one. Does anyone remember the title? Southern Skepticism. I can't remember, but it's for people who are further back than that. Like, I don't even consider the question of God a relevant question. It's also written a book for them. And I think both of them are really, really first rate. I would, and this can be a really fascinating exercise. If you've ever just given yourself the task of reading through the New Testament, looking for a particular thing, I did it many years ago, looking for all the references to the end times. It's amazing how many there are. But what I would be suggesting here is just give yourself the task of reading through the New Testament over 2 or 3 months, looking for all examples of this grace narrative and the way in which the grace that Jesus is talking about, that Paul and others are talking about, is radical and undermines the performance narrative. That would be a really rich exercise to conduct as well.
Yeah, it sounds awesome. Thank you all for coming today. It's great you're all to be here. There's going to be no forum next week, but there'll be one the week after, which will be about belief in God and kind of the logic and ask what that question means and all of that stuff, which will be really interesting. You can find more of our stuff on Facebook. But yeah, please stay on for the discussion, and let's give a good thank you for Chris for coming. Thanks,